Hey everyone, welcome to the space. Hopefully, this will start filling up. Um, I was going to offer my general thoughts on the matter and actually kind of make some bold predictions. Um, I I think we are in a new paradigm, and I don't want to get out ahead of myself, but I want to tell you all what I'm thinking and and you can react to that. First, let me share this space rather, and I will then get started. Um, First off, I thought this was a really fiery and bold State of the Union. It was powerful. Biden, yes, his personality has changed a bit in 10 years, and he's older. But I think he continually is underestimated by Republicans who are effectively claiming that he's a senile old fool and doesn't know what he's doing. Well, Biden has never been smart, and I mean, he's never been brilliant and insightful. He's obviously a very smart and cagey and even ruthless in some cases politician. Um, that's different than being an intellectual, which of course he's not. But I don't think anyone can watch what we just saw and simply conclude that, this man is, you know, on death's door. He's should be in an old folks' home or something. He actually gave a very powerful speech, and that should be noted. First off, starting out at the beginning, and I think this will get us a little bit closer to some of my bigger feelings on this matter. Um, I tweeted out, Christ, I missed the Cold War. Did anyone catch that reference? It's actually a line from Casino Royale, the movie. But it, this obviously had a very strong Cold War feeling. Um, it might have, in some ways, evoked George W. Bush's, 2002 State of the Union, or or later, where he was clearly pushing for war with Iraq. But obviously, there's just really significant differences between Iraq and the current crisis in Ukraine. Iraq was a war of choice. It was a war of our choice. Obviously, it had some strategic impulse in terms of the region, oil rich region that includes Israel, etc. But it was obviously unnecessary. And it was in some ways, I guess, an understandable reaction to 9/11. Someone has got to get hit for that. This is a different situation. It was a Cold War speech. Um, yes, in many ways, we're to blame for the crisis in Ukraine. However, I think that in some ways can be overstated. The fact is, bringing back Ukraine into the fold is a long term strategic goal of Vladimir Putin and the Russian sphere as he understands it. It also is just bringing us back into an older 20th century paradigm with Russia as a real opponent. It brings back fear. It brings back the threat of nuclear war. It brings back the threat of the great game of big empires, of great powers. It brings all of those things back. And in many ways, Biden is right for that moment. Um, I don't want to give a close reading of this State of the Union. I simply want to talk about the big picture, but I will talk about one detail. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Biden said that he is shutting down, basically shutting down any kind of Russian flight into the United States, and that is flights of any kind. Obviously, that includes military flights, but this would also include commercial flights and so on. This kind of thing is huge. Um, Russia has been shut out of the world. I've seen uh, news items on Russian students being expelled at European universities. I don't quite know how widespread that is. The sanctions, obviously, everyone's talking about that. There are Swiss bank sanctions, which the Swiss famously did this in no other circumstances, including the Second World War. Um, that is a major change. There's a lot of talk of Ukraine entering the European Union. There is just world is speaking with one voice. It is remarkable. It's also bringing about this bifurcation, and I really think that it's not just a Russian sphere that we're seeing arise as like a security sphere. It's a Russian world, and this is a term that Anatoly Karlin has talked about. A guy who I guess we're at odds of late, but I have always respected Anatoly and his writing. But it's a Russian world in the sense that, I mean, this is a minor item. So there's a new Batman movie that comes out this Friday. It's not going, Warner Brothers pulled it from Russia. They're not going to see this movie. These, again, it's just one thing. You might say I'm making too much of it. It's actually part of a massive trend, which is going to be the separation of a West and a Russian world. And we might even see another kind of civilizational state arising in the form of China. Obviously, there are going to be a lot of differences there, and the Chimerica relationship is still intact, and so on. But this really is major. During the Soviet period, there was obviously trade you want to call it. There was exchange on a very high level. There was a exchange of natural resources from both sides. There was a lot of agriculture that went to the Soviet Union. The Russia has always been you know rich in natural resources and so on. That was done at a very high level. What you found were kind of like these parallels. You know, Hollywood had 2001. The Soviet Union had Solaris a few years later. Those are both immensely famous films. Both are masterworks. You had kind of like Soviet versions of Western luxury goods and Western consumer items. And you saw even that in places like the East Germany or the German Democratic Republic, where they would have a kind of parallel version of life in the West. And yeah, maybe it wasn't as rich and fancy, but it was something. But the key thing, because I'm not making judgments here, is that they were parallel worlds that had no communication. Um, I think I think it's going to be very hard for Russians to attend university in the United States. Russian people who aren't citizens are going to have a hard time staying in the United States. Communication, movies, there's going to be a kind of digital iron curtain to the degree that that's possible. And it is possible again, to a certain degree. That is remarkable. There are a lot of bad things about that. I wish the Russian people the best. I have affection for Russia, but we are returning to that state of affairs. This is absolutely a new paradigm. There seemed to be a kind of new paradigm every, say, 5 to 7 years, and then I think that things might have actually sped up recently. So, what I mean by that is that it dominates consciousness, it dominates the news cycle. There is some kind of economic impulse behind it. And it is basically what is on everyone's mind. Every headline you read is ultimately about this, even if it might be about something else. So, for instance, after the end of the Cold War, in the late '90s, I can remember that there was a kind of new economy paradigm, the dot com bubble, and all that went along with that. Obviously, 9/11 and the Iraq War put us on a new paradigm. Every single headline, every State of the Union address, every movie, every talk show was ultimately about 9/11, Islamic terrorism, and the invasion of Iraq. That paradigm uh, traveled a long ways in 5 years. It went from shock to war fervor to bitterness really quickly. And even by the election of 2004, John Kerry had gone from, scolding other Democrats in his party for not voting for the Iraq War to effectively being the anti war choice. And there was a tremendous amount of bitterness that came as 2004 went on. And then there was the surge and endless insurgency and doubt and guilt and so on. By 2008, Iraq had largely been forgotten, and the financial crisis was the paradigm. We had a few years where maybe not a lot was going on. Once you get into the 2010s, I'm not sure the Tea Party counts as a paradigm. Then we reached Trump. Every headline from summer of 2015 on was ultimately about Trump. Either it was denial, it was shock, it was surprise. Trump was getting canceled in so many ways. Trump won. It was all about him. He was in everyone's head. He dominated that paradigm. 2020, that switched to COVID. And Trump kind of played into that. It was a kind of maybe a dual paradigm that was going on where everything was about COVID. Everyone becomes a virologist of the amateur variety on social media. It's just what everyone is thinking about. I don't think this Ukraine invasion is just going to go away. I think it is an extremely big deal. It is actually in many ways it's bigger than COVID and it's bigger than Trump. And I think it is, even if you use this State of the Union as a marker, it's clearly just push those things aside. Trump is fading away. He's fading in relevance. He doesn't have anything to really tell us on this subject, outside of Putin's a smart guy or whatever, but he doesn't really have anything powerful or relevant to say about this coming paradigm, which I would strongly suggest is a 20th century paradigm that is a return to a bifurcated world, maybe to a degree a trifurcated one. We'll see, but at the very least, the Russian sphere, the Russian world is going to be cut off from the Western world. Again, some very obviously bad things about that, but there are actually some good things about that. Um, Western and Central European integration has never moved this quickly. I'm almost wondering if Brexit might be uh, withdrawn at some point. I think that might very well be in the cards, but I simply mention that to show how far this is going and how intensely this is developing. Um, Europe is speaking on one page. Europe is on a war footing. There are polls indicating that large amounts of people think that there is going to be a land war in Europe. I'm not so sure about that. I think Putin has very, very specific ambitions in Ukraine. He has a goal of bringing Ukraine into the fold. But again, even if there is not a hot war on the continent, there is going to be a serious Cold War divide. The NATO is now relevant again. NATO lost its relevancy after the Cold War. After all, it was founded as an anti Russian or anti Soviet alliance. That is its origins. In the 90s, you could plausibly argue that NATO should just go away. Bill Clinton used it in the name and to basically intervene in a conflict on the European continent, but one that perhaps he should not have ever gone into, one that should be looked at very skeptically. And you could even further question whether NATO had anything to do with a crisis in the Balkans. Since then, again, NATO's raison d'etre, its legitimacy, has been in question. Its legitimacy is no longer in question. In fact, there is a tremendous push for nations like Finland, Estonia, et cetera, to join NATO. They realize what it means. So I think we've returned to this 20th century. And look, I have to say, I think there are a lot of great things about that. Um, I am a dyed in the wool Nietzschean. I have always agreed with Nietzsche's injunction about being a good European. That is overcoming the kind of atavistic call of nationalism and moving towards Europe as an imperial bloc. Now, beyond philosophy, and many people have, of course, attempted something like that. Napoleon attempted something like that. I think obviously, Hitler was a German nationalist. As the war went on, the National Socialists began increasingly understanding themselves as engaged in a European project. There's actually a magazine called Europa that expressed just that. Stalin had a vision of uniting Europe. He basically felt that after Yalta, it was only a matter of time before the capitalists turn on each other and undergo some kind of crisis, and we'd have a united Europe, obviously under communism or more specifically under him. There have been other visions, obviously the foundation of the EU with Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi and at the beginning, before the war, in fact, but then going on later with the coal and steel coalition, there have been visions. That was an entirely economic vision, but it seemed to all express this impulse. Well, Putin, that is having a great enemy abroad, has pushed all of those things over the edge. They are now really happening. They are happening at a ferocious pace. And again, there might be some nationalists in the audience. That's fine. I think this is entirely a good thing. It's something that I want, and Putin has done it. Generally speaking, I would say that there needs to be an enemy in the world for civilization to exist. So, and it needs to be a real enemy. There needs to be some kind of Cold War going on somewhere for civilization to remain decent, for there to be a concept of an us, for there to be just a proper functioning of a state and a people. Over the past 30 years, America has turned on itself. It has become deeply decadent, deeply insane society. Now, there are obviously some very deep causes to that, and maybe causes that nothing can really solve. I get that, obviously. But I do think that having a global enemy and engaging in some kind of fight and having that as as someone like Ed Dutton would say, having a kind of mortality salience, that is the fear of imminent death and destruction, is a good thing for the functioning of civilization. It's not just a good thing, it's a necessary thing, and it can't function otherwise. If we don't have an enemy abroad, we will turn on ourselves. And thus, the new neo Cold War, as I'm describing it, is good. Period. Let me go out on a limb here a bit and talk a little bit about projections. Now, these aren't hard and fast predictions. This is basically what I am thinking right now. I reserve the right to reassess. Everyone gets out ahead of themselves, etc. Things change. But what I see from the State of the Union address is there's a lot of nationalism. There's a lot of sense of national purpose with Biden. The woke stuff is mostly thrown out the window. Biden did mention some federal law about transsexuals or whatever, but that was a gesture, and it was a very small thing. 99% of the speech was not about that. It was about the first 10 minutes or 15 was about Russia. The rest of it was about a kind of can do nationalism and infrastructure. He was doing all of those things that Trump basically, why we were so excited about Trump, what Trump promised. Um, Buy American. Let's create these projects together. We're one America. Now, of course, you can look at all this skeptically and say that will never happen. There's some of these problems, et cetera, et cetera. The fact is, you have to look at the change that something like this brings about. And you have to also look at the dynamic. One thing that I think is going to be happening in the near future is that the ultranationalist populist right is going to be outflanked by the liberals now that we have entered a neo Cold War situation. All of that Russia, Russia, Russia stuff from the Trump era, which, if I'm fair, has more than a few kernels of truth to it, but it was obviously overstated in many ways. I think it's very clear that Russia wanted Trump to win both elections. Now, there's some nuance there that I could go into, but I won't right now. It's obviously also very clear that Russia was engaged in serious shenanigans online in the promotion of the Trump movement. But if you understand the Trump movement as ultra nationalist, then yes, I think liberals are going to outflank the ultra nationalists on the right. The ultra nationalists are a bit tainted by Putin, but Trump can't really walk back his Putin's invasion of Ukraine was brilliant. He's so smart. He can't really walk that back, even if that statement could kind of be defended in some level of, yes, of course, Putin's smart. The fact is, the entire Western world is united under sanction the hell out of Russia. Neo Cold War is on once again. We are no longer going to get energy from Russia. Nord Stream rather is canceled, and we want to join NATO, and we support plucky Ukraine. That's where the entire white race, if we want to use those terms, that's how the white race is unified right now. And saying that Putin's is smart, he's awesome, it goes over like a lead balloon. It clangs. It just is not what people want to hear. And Joe Biden, a old Cold Warrior, has a lot more resonance in this kind of environment. And all of the kind of, I don't know, vague isolationism, contradictory isolationism just doesn't work. Trump was saying, let's get out of NATO at one point in 2015 and 2016. Now he kind of reneged. He was like, well, I just want NATO to work. I want us to get more money from NATO or whatever. But all of that is just meaningless. People want a national purpose. They might wanted to have heard, let's get out of NATO at one point. Today they want to hear about a national purpose. So the liberals are going to successfully outflank the Trump movement on the right. And the Trump movement is going to increasingly fade into irrelevance. There is no chance of Trump winning election in 2024. We'll see what happens in the Republican primary, which it begins a year from now, effectively. We'll see what happens. There might be some new faces. You see the return of Mitt Romney. We want these old white guys to run, basically, as cold warriors who know how the game's played. All of that is possible. But he will not win in 2024. If he wins the Republican nomination, he's going to get smoked. I am less certain about a Republican takeover of Congress because we've just moved to a new stage. We're not talking about critical race theory anymore. We're not going to talk about the woke stuff anymore. That stuff is canceled. It's going to be talking about national security and national purpose. And the just stupidity and insanity of the MAGA movement leads them down these roads where all they want to talk about is mass mandates and vaccines and whining about government and hating the government, etc. That is not going to fly. So I am not so certain about this year, 2022 midterms. I'm not so certain anymore. I think that it was the conventional call. Every major commentator said the Democrats are going to lose in the midterms. I'm not so certain about that, but I'll reassess, as summer comes along. I'm very certain about the presidential election, and I'm very certain about just kind of the end of the populist moment. That paradigm of populism is over. It just doesn't work anymore. It does not speak to anyone anymore. It has no ability to rise to the challenge of this current paradigm that we're in. All right. That's enough from me. We have 136 in here. That's good. If you would like to speak, please make a request, and I'll let you have the floor. So you have to make a request if you want to speak. You can ask a question, make a comment. No one wants to speak. There we go. Okay. Salt, you can speak.
All the bad takes coming out of the dissident right. Do you think it's mostly an antisocial phenomenon, or do you assume they actually do believe that Putin is somehow the better choice here?
Well, look, I made some of these bad takes in 2014, so I shouldn't be the one to talk in many ways. I understand the Putin phenomenon. I mean, at the end of the day, Putin is a gangster who announces war plans to a palatial room full of billionaire oligarchs. I mean, that's who he ultimately is. It's a petrostate. But I think we can easily project onto Putin, and maybe there's some reason to project onto Putin some kind of white hero or savior of Russia or so on. I think he does, to his credit, have a conception of a Russian sphere and a Russian world that traces back to the Soviet Union and to the Russian Empire. So that is something that makes him attractive. But I think a lot of it, if I'm honest, is largely synthetic. In the sense of bad takes coming from the dissident right. I think that there has been a tremendous amount of Russian outreach to thought leaders. And it doesn't take that much money. It's not that hard to kind of shift people, particularly people who are very suggestible.
I just want to say Putin is a triple OG gangster for defending the January 6th protesters. He said they came there with legitimate political demands and their, human rights were trampled on. He's the only political world leader, one of the few to talk about the demographic replacement of white Christians in America. He's the content king of geopolitics, basically the baked Alaska of geopolitics. Really great.
Smile. I get what you're saying, but he's not saying any of that because he actually cares. He wants to see the West weakened in his own country. It has a worse birth rate than almost any other region if you control for what regions are actually inhabited by ethnic Russians as opposed to Barats, Chechens, or Dagestanis, or Avars, or something like that.
Yeah, look, Putin has, if you believe Michael McFaul, who relayed this comment, and I do not like Michael McFaul at all, but I don't feel like he has any need. There's no reason for him to lie about this. Putin is very clear in person that he does not consider himself white. Now, Putin will play these games, and there is a lot of Eurasian influence among Russians that they like to talk like this. Putin will speak up for the January 6th people as simply a way of spreading chaos in the United States, which is all that January 6th accomplished. He has also spoke up in favor of Black Lives Matter. He has called the West racist. This is another thing Dugin does. I don't think Dugin is deeply connected with Putin, but it's a common theme. Putin will also, kind of say things that are, it's hard to disagree with. Like we've lost our minds in the West, and we're questioning the difference between sexes and so on. Fair enough, but I don't really need him to say that. And I think someone mentioned this not too long ago, where it's like in the 20th century Cold War, you would have a lot of, say, African Americans or feminists or whatever who would kind of identify with the Soviet Union or kind of play footsie with it, just merely out of a feeling of alienation. They didn't actually want to be communists, and they certainly didn't want to live in the Soviet Union. But it was just a feeling of alienation, a kind of middle finger, very similar to a phenomenon of like punk rock musicians in the late 70s and early 80s wearing the swastika. Were they Nazis, or were they just simply trying to say F you to the British ruling class? The latter is the case. And this infatuation with this man, I don't know. I fell into that trap too. I am not innocent of this, but I guess I'm a little bit older and hopefully wiser, and I just do not see it that way. I respect his ambitions, but as someone who even wants to revive the white race or America or Western Europe, he is not that. He wants chaos in the United States. That is all he wants, and that is all that things like the Internet Research Institute and all of their propaganda promote. They promote chaos and division. He wants the worst for the West. Now, if you want that too, if you want it to just go down in flames, then, by all means, be a Putin fan. But I ultimately don't want that. I want a strengthening of the West. I want a unification and centralization of the West, in fact. And I do not want nationalism. I want Europeanism. And
I
he
guess.
is creating that.
Sorry. I guess the last part of my question is a few months ago, these same people were cheering and hollering for the Taliban in Afghanistan throwing out an imperial power. And
Exactly.
now when Ukrainians who, there are people, they're distant relatives, but there are people, they have this a whole 120 IQ thing where they try to play geopolitics in their mind or think it's about NATO and completely disregard the wishes of the Ukrainian people. They somehow think the process of a drag queen story hour in 20 or 30 years is more dangerous to them than the nation next door that kept them economically impoverished and genocided them in the 1920s.
Yeah. There's going to be drag queen story hour in Moscow in 22 years. I mean, this decline of the West is a secular phenomenon. And I don't know. Some might disagree with me on that. Fair enough. But whatever we want to say, I mean, look, I think this could have been handled a lot better by NATO. But at the end of it, there could have been, say, some kind of compromise solution. I suggested this on JF last night. Maybe, who knows? Maybe we could have reached a solution of saying, all right, Ukraine is in the Russian security zone. I.e., it will never become a NATO member, but it gets to be part of the European Union at some point. Some kind of compromise. If I were in the State Department, maybe I would have offered something like this. But the fact is, we're past that. And like NATO is at its origins an anti-Russian alliance, period. So like these claims of like, why is NATO bullying Russia? It's like, I don't know what to say. It's like asking why Michael Jordan dunks the basketball. I mean, it's like, that's what it is.
What would you say the chances that this gets like it devolves into nuclear war? Is that, I don't know, less than 5% or?
Yeah, I think it's around there. I mean, I think the question is like, will a nuclear weapon be used at some point in the foreseeable future? I mean, we haven't used one since 1940. No one has used a nuclear device in an armed conflict since 1945. Obviously, been testing and so on. But will one be used aggressively? If you look at it on like a century scale, it seems to almost be 100%. Like it's going to happen. Now, is the world going to end in the next 20 years? No, I don't think so. Is there a strong chance, like 5%, that, again, that's a strong chance when we're talking about nuclear weapons. Obviously, we're not, talking about, is it going to rain tomorrow or something? Is there a strong chance that a nuclear weapon could be used in the next 20 years? Yeah, I think so.
What would you say to someone who sides with Russia because they hate NATO? Like, I tend to agree with you when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, but like most of my conservative friends, they'll side with Russia purely just because they hate NATO.
Are you British?
Yeah, British.
Okay.
Northern.
Okay. I'm a bit surprised that your conservative friends in Britain hate NATO, but it is what it is. I mean, I think there is kind of like a reasonable argument to be made that after the Cold War, that either NATO could be disbanded or, I mean, this is very out there and heady, that Russia joins NATO. And basically it becomes truly a unified military command for the Northern Hemisphere and the white race. And that is a very bold suggestion. That's the kind of thing that I look forward to happening eventually. But something like that could never happen under Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's a former KGB officer. He understands. He does not think of the world as the Northern Hemisphere and the white race. He thinks of the world as a Russian sphere.
Richard, let me ask you this. Why do we really care about what Putin's true intentions are? If he is delegitimizing the West and
he's not doing that.
Well, to some degree he is.
No, he's not in the slightest
Okay.
bit. He is reviving the West. He is unifying the West. He is giving the West purpose. This is another thing.
That is a fair point. That's a fair point.
Okay. But you guys, you have to get the analysis right before you can start making these takes. I feel like people just want to have some kind of take, and they want everything to be going wrong, and we can complain about everything and whatever. No, actually things change. I think there are certain dynamics to things that you have to recognize. I mean, did you see Joe Biden's speech and him just talking about, tranny story hour? No,
I
talked
did
about
not.
American purpose. I mean, that is what's happening. And
right, but why do we
united?
Why do we want American purpose? Because we know what that does.
Well, I mean, I understand that, but it's not it's not like America is incapable of having a decent civilized society and there actually being good things about this country. I mean, I don't know. I mean, and I don't blame like wokeness and general decadence merely on America. I think it is a secular phenomenon. But it's just I don't know. Like, wouldn't you rather live in a country that is not this self-destructive?
I would. Yes.
You know?
Do you think Putin becoming more powerful on the global stage is good for American dissidents? Because commentators like Nick Fuentes seem to be of the opinion that the CCP and Putin rising is, at odds with the American regime, and that can only benefit American dissidents.
American dissidents?
Yeah, so
Um,
if our number one enemy is the American regime and the enemies of the American regime are becoming more powerful, his take is basically that that only means that can be good for American dissidents and our safety moving forward.
Is
our
Russia becoming more
safety.
powerful?
I mean, you guys have such awful assumptions. I don't even know what to say. I'm going to speak as frankly as I can. Chanting Putin at a rally in this atmosphere is going to end up getting you arrested. And taking part in boondoggles like January 6th are going to get you arrested. So I don't know what to say. Like, Putin wants chaos. He might want to throw money at some dissident, and if it weakens the West, but whether that's good for the dissident himself remains to be seen.
I would sort of like to push back also on the claim that secularism is what is creating this drag queen story hour type thing, because you didn't really see that in the Soviet Union, and they were a secular nation.
Yeah.
So it's more so that comfort is what is creating this kind of thing.
Luxury is. I think there's a general decadence. I could talk about like the death of God and all that means, but I'm going to save that for another one. Um, in terms of like history, the Soviet Union has mostly sponsored the left, so they have gone to they've gone to radical leftists. The Red Army faction in Germany is paradigmatic, and they have basically sponsored violent wackos. Now, they've also made outreach. They've simply made straight payments to people who want to betray the national security state and betray their country in Washington. Like they'll simply just pay people. It's not really an ideological thing. They will go after kind of fellow traveler types who are highly placed in elite universities, etc. They will certainly do something like that. In terms of supporting dissidents, they will, pay uh, lunatics because they want chaos and they want weakening in the West. They don't want a revived America. They want chaos. That's why they like January 6th and the stuff like that. In terms of Putin's strategy, I mean, I think Putin clearly was behind Trump to some degree. He was enthusiastic about Trump. I don't think he invented Trump or Trump was a Manchurian candidate or any of that nonsense, but he wanted Trump to win for his own reasons. And in many ways, what was interesting about the last few years is there's this radicalization of the mainstream. The Trump movement became much more fanatical and radical, and was doing things like J6. It was getting into QAnon. All of that stuff was kind of fringe and mainstream at the same time. So Putin wasn't, sponsoring dissidents. Putin was instead kind of almost entering the mainstream. Another thing was the NRA girl. I'm forgetting her name at the moment. They send an NRA chick to, go infiltrate the NRA, the gun movement, and lo and behold, she had sex with a number of people. Surprise, surprise. But there was an attempt at that. There was an attempt at almost getting in with the mainstream conservatives. So it's very different than the Soviet espionage situation. So I don't know what to say, but if you're going to be a dissident in this type of environment, then good luck to you. But you will be crushed, and Putin is not going to save you. I mean, are the American first people going to defect to Russia?
Well, as far as the dissident thing goes, I mean, maybe safety wasn't the right word for me to use, but basically, I think the line of thinking.
Money, is that the word you want to use? That's going to end. That's going
Well,
to get you in jail. What other support is he going to give you?
if the American regime is our biggest threat and the enemies of the American regime are becoming more powerful, that means the regime that's preventing us from using our intellectual freedom and deplatforming us and all the other obstacles that we have to deal with are going to have a chance at least of becoming less relevant. I guess maybe that's a better way of explaining.
So how is Putin going to do this outside of invading the United States or engaging in some kind of cyber attack or something?
Well,
do you see how when you talk this way, you just immediately head into illegal and treasonous activity?
Well,
like, this is what I'm saying.
Of all,
this stuff was fun 4 years ago. It is over. And like, for any of you people, you American groypers or whatever, like that you hear my voice, if you are mildly intelligent, you will listen to me. And if you are just a baked Alaska retard, you will go down this road and you will end up in prison. And that's a good thing, because that will take you idiots off the streets.
But J6, on the other hand, that was a serious political statement. That was the first time in memorable modern history that the American people rose up and reminded their representatives who was in charge. We actually put the power on the system and put the pressure on them when the system failed, when we had a rigged election. And that was the first time.
You only caused yourself to be more suppressed. Like,
I mean, these people are such idiots. How did that go for them? You had hundreds of people in jail. They all got deplatformed. It is the most illegitimate thing in the world, viewed from anyone who has a modicum of intelligence. People have forgotten about Charlottesville, for God's sake.
And also, isn't like the Groypers' whole thing that they're going to like penetrate the system? Like, you can't just do what they did in January 6th and then also claim that like you're going to infiltrate somehow.
Oh, well, I don't support I don't support Nick Fuentes or any of that shit, but isn't that sort of what Richard is suggesting, is infiltrating the American empire at large or whatever?
Not at all.
No. I'm making a different claim. I'm saying that these people are being hypocritical. Like, they're trying to play two different faces at once, and these positions are just irreconcilable.
They're totally irreconcilable, but I often see this from people. But behind the pragmatist mask is a kind of like seething nihilist, and behind the nihilist mask is a kind of goofy Republican voter, where they all want to like, oh, we've got to win this election, and Trump is our man, he's our guy, wave the flag or something, and then he loses, and then they're just like, oh yeah, let's engage in treason. I mean, it's just insane. I mean, there are like a myriad of middle paths in there that aren't going to get you thrown into prison, or I don't know, like literally execute something. I mean, maybe not, but this is just insane. They can't think straight. They only think in terms of, we're going to elect a Republican next year and he's going to save us, or, we go rogue.
Yeah, and also, why do they presume that, like, if America is in decline, that somehow it will be their particular brand of dissident politics that takes power? Like,
No.
These different regimes love to pit people against each other. Why would other people not rise in authority as well?
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is, I mentioned the Red Army faction. I mean, there is certainly a possibility that now that Putin and Russia are on their heels, I mean, I don't think they fully expected like this level of just unanimous sanctioning and support, that they might start going to the radical end. Like, why not go and give money to the Boogaloo Boys or something, and give them M16s and say, have at it. I mean, who knows? They might go much harder than they have been, because they've been using a velvet glove of late. Russian outreach has been online. It's been Twitter troll factories, etc. and it has been like above board lobbying, like going to the conservative movement and again, and it's been effective to some degree. It is kind of hard to imagine Tucker Carlson saying this, I'm rooting for Putin or whatever. He's saying that on Fox News. It's hard to imagine that. Certainly 20 years ago, and even 5 years ago, maybe. So it is something has worked, but that is now over. I mean, that is not going to work anymore. I think I might be overestimating things. I think it would be very hard for Russian immigrants. I think it's going to be very hard for a Russian student exchange. Um, Basic goods are going to start existing in parallel. I mean, I think things are going to really change. And who knows? You can say, "Oh, Richard, you're exaggerating," or maybe, but I don't think I am. I think we have entered a totally new geopolitical paradigm.
Further, the assumption that Fuentes fan was making is that Russia is getting stronger on the world stage. If anything, no matter what outcome happens here, at best they've inherited an economy the size of Kentucky and a population which will be a giant sore spot for them that CIA can press on any time to make them scream, and that's the best case scenario. A case scenario was a 1990s collapse economically.
Yes, and
they still have their natural resources.
They do have a natural resources. Just for what it's worth, I don't wish Russia the worst. I understand the kind of situation we're in, but I have affection for Russians and Russia and Russian culture. I don't wish them the worst. I don't want to go and inspire chaos in their society. But excuse me, I have this lingering cough. I've had it for about a week. I can't get rid of it. Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in? We kind of have a good free for all going.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Richard.
Sure.
I just want to point out that there's this perception in certain areas of the dissident right, particularly in I would say kind of the BAP sphere, or like they're the kind of the manosphere, like retards, the pickup artist types also, that, Putin is this kind of he's this alpha, in that he's somehow like weakening NATO and weakening the regime. And you hear that from some of these people that think that, like, this strong Putin is he's weakening the West and he's exposing NATO. But really, the irony is that the opposite is happening, and we're going to see actually an expansion of NATO. Whereas, like, if you would have talked to me just like a month ago, I would have said, like, but Russia's not really a threat to anyone. Like, why don't we just why are we still antagonizing them or something? Well, those arguments just aren't going to sell as well now. And I think a lot of those kind of Putin shills are just going to become, at least temporarily, marginalized.
Yeah.
And, and I think Russia really miscalculated by conducting such a full-scale invasion, because it ultimately, it was so shocking and appalling to so many people around the world that if they had done things more covertly, and just, fostering like color revolutions and independence movements, I don't think that, you would have seen the kind of outrage if there was just a limited incursion, into, certain parts of Ukraine or something. But the scale and magnitude of the invasion, I think, was it was so over the top. Even if you were going to say that, like, well, Ukraine had NATO aspirations and they were like, provoking, like, it's just not on the same level of equivalence there in the minds of most people.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything you've said, basically. I mean, the central takeaway is that he has strengthened NATO. Now, I would say this. I think it's fair to say that Putin miscalculated. And I don't know if even in their worst I don't know. They probably calculated for a worst possible scenario of like a NATO attack on Russia or something. But I don't think in any of their reasonable scenarios, reasonably bad scenarios, they expected this level of unity, and like Sweden and Estonia and Finland being like, all right, we sign up, let's get in. I don't think so. But I wonder if Putin is himself entirely opposed to all this, because again, I've used the term Russian sphere, and you could think of it as the term Grossraum, which is a German term. Schmidt picked it up. It was actually developed by someone else, but a large area, a zone of influence, a kind of imperial state that stretches maybe even beyond, it's something much bigger than a nation state. It's an imperial zone where you have natural resources, defensible borders, etc. But I think also there's the kind of idea of a Russian world, and it's this, maybe on some level, Putin, like literally wants to go back to the USSR, in the sense that, like, when we Russians, when we play the global game, we're kind of playing second fiddle. But maybe we could just have this, huge zone with 150 million people in it, where it's just kind of all Russian all the time. And you're not like looking at Paris and thinking, oh, I wish I could be there, or looking at Nebraska and saying, I wish I could go there. You're kind of like in this large island. And I wonder if he almost wants that on some level. And it's kind of welcomes these sanctions. It's like, let's just get it over with, Let's stop pretending that we're part of this, EU or neoliberal or American order. I don't know.
I think that that part of it is psychological, because even if you look at the segments of the dissident right that find Putin to be impressive, it's like, I think Putin has a very it's superficial, like projections of machismo and like a macho image. And so from his perspective and the perspective of these types of people, they think like, well, the West is feminine, like they can't do shit. Like, here's Alpha Putin, he's going to go in there and take out the trash or something. And they're going to find out that that the West militarily can get serious, like in a second, if they want to, and that substantive things militarily and in terms of like intelligent people and more substantive qualities, like that, these things matter more than the superficial macho image. I mentioned before on Twitter that anecdote about with George W. Bush about the dog, and how Putin said, like, just really just a low class insult. He made fun of Bush's like little Scottish Terrier, and he's like, my dog is bigger, faster, and stronger than your dog Barney or something. Which it seems like such a small thing, but it's just like it gives you insight into his character, that he values the appearance of a macho image over these other qualities, which may be more substantive or tangible. And I think that it also translates, I think, historically to, a lot of the Soviet Union. And even if you look at some of like the Arab-Israeli conflicts, which were like a proxy for some of that back in the 70s, in the similar kinds of attitudes.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it, actually. It is there is a certain pettiness. And I would just say, it's like, you on Twitter, it's fun to make fun of the they them army and just be like, oh yeah, our Chechen badass, Muslim guys are just gonna kick your ass. You're a bunch of trannies and you're gonna, fold at the first sight of blood or whatever. Okay, I get that, but like at the end of the day, like, again, the NATO military system is a real thing. And there are actual very serious soldiers in the US Army who will kill you. There are bombs that will kill you. There are drone strikes that will kill you. There are Swiss bankers who are not woke transsexuals. and they will take your money. You know, they're actually really boring men in suits, and they are highly competent. And I just, yeah, I mean, I think it's the kind of, yeah, like the Baphism where you just kind of like live online in this fantasy macho world that, you know, has some kernels of truth to it, of course, but it just is just ultimately disconnected from reality.
I just wanted to follow up to what you were saying before. You were surprised that there was British conservatives who are anti-NATO, and
Yeah.
when I say British conservatives, I don't mean sort of like the, you know, like the well-educated sort of posh ones, like, you know, the like the blue wall kind of
Right.
working ones, and like all that Trump stuff that you sort of like always speak out against, like QAnon and that sort of stuff, that has become massive over here. Like my
Oh
mum's
God.
talking about it. Yeah, I know it's awful. Like, and it's not just men; it's like sort of like young, like attractive women, people that wouldn't have ever had anything to do with politics. They're like well into it, and I'm seeing stuff like they're saying, first of all, like it's not real. It's all just like a distraction from COVID, New World Order, like sort of stuff that like Tucker Carlson's saying. And then yeah, like there's generally quite a lot of support for Putin from them. But then when it comes to like the sort of more middle class, well-educated, intelligent conservatives, there's no support for Putin or Russia whatsoever. And the other interesting thing I've noticed is an awful lot of Muslims and immigrants support Putin, like Pakistanis and Indians and Bangladeshis, that sort of thing. They, one of the things they're talking a lot about at the moment is like they're upset that they weren't allowed to go and fight for sort of like the extremists in Syria against Assad, but like they're saying because, you know, the British Army is prepared to arm people to go fight for Ukraine, that just shows like the sort of like, you know, our foreign policy is based on racialism, and yeah, it's like all just because they're blonde hair and blue eyes, even though obviously like Russians are as well to some extent. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting thing to note.
Richard, do you think the world is better off without a multipolar world order and safer?
Do I think the world is better off without a multipolar world and safer?
World
Yes.
world order.
Yeah, I think the world is better off with a world order, whether that is a unipolar order that we've had over the past 30 years, more or less, or a kind of bifurcated, a Cold War style thing. Yeah, I mean, I people who talk about like multipolarity or something, they don't understand what that's going to entail. I mean, someone has to kind of set the agenda for these things and, you know, open up the waterways and make things work and have a kind of, you know, a currency that can be traded everywhere. And without that, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more nastiness and so on. But I would say the future is kind of more like the civilizational state. You know, I mean, I think if what happen if what we think or what I think is gonna happen happens, then we are gonna be moving towards like a Russian sphere of influence, a Russian world, a united Europe and a Western world, maybe a Chinese world that might maybe that Chimerica thing starts to fall apart and we move away from that. So I think we're moving towards these big block civilizational states. But that again, that brings its own stability. That can work. But just like true multipolarity is insane.
I will say, I think that this kind of modern dissident kind of fracturing has kind of, I would say, put the nail in the coffin of grassroots kind of populism. Because if
Yeah.
you look at all of these social movements, political movements, pretty much throughout history, they were always led by a very intelligent, competent vanguard of basically philosophers and elites that would take the population, manipulate them and sometimes, in a tyrannical way, sometimes benevolently for their own good, to basically a new world order, as you're mentioning. So I think that we've seen that these people just get manipulated over and over again, whether it's by Trump or by Putin. It's just constantly, they're just conned every single time.
Yeah.
So I don't understand like how this is going to work in the long run for them.
What is going to work? Are you talking about like populism?
Yeah, populism. I don't think they actually have real political solutions. It's all just
No,
kind
they
of
have
like
no
video
political
games.
solutions. There's nothing coming out of the MAGA right that even resembles policy. And if it might resemble policy, then it's just totally negative. Let's ban critical race theory in schools or something. Which, fair enough, but that's not really anything. That's just pure negativity and whining and agitating. And no, I think the populist moment is over. I mean, it's been a fun ride. But it is, I just do not think it makes sense in this context. I mean, even like anti-war movements like the America First Committee, the original one, it was disbanded and vanished after the US entered the Second World War. It just no longer made sense. Now, again, we can have lots of different opinions on whether America could get involved, et cetera, et cetera. But that's just a fact. And I think the same thing is going to happen in 2021 and 22 or sorry, we're past 21, 2022 and onward. It just doesn't speak to us anymore. What is the populist movement offering? Say no to mask or whatever, or vaccine conspiracies. I mean, people are over this. One thing I didn't mention earlier, even in the State of the Union, did you notice that Biden kind of offered an olive branch to vaccine skeptics? He was basically saying, like, look, COVID has been hell on earth. Hopefully we're past the worst of it. um, no one had any, real answer for this. Thank God we're past it, but we now want to just see each other again and stop politicizing. I mean, he was trying to overcome polarization of the virus. Remarkable. That's where we are. The populist movement doesn't have anything to say. What do they have to say about the current world order that's unfolding? Putin's really smart. I mean, that's just stupid. I mean, I agree he's smart, of course, but it's just a stupid statement, ironically. Um, Andrew, have you spoken yet? I think you've had your hand up, and then I'll go to Juan.
No. So I've just kind of been thinking about this as far as Russia's concerned. I apologize if this has been brought up. I joined late, but their demographic situation, their low birth rates, but the Muslim question, as far like I believe within like 50 years, Russia's going to be a third Muslim, and it kind of looks like, I mean, who knows if this could recharge or bring any sort of energy, fighting spirit to like the West and NATO. I'm certainly skeptical, but it kind of looks like, like sort of the Byzantine Empire on one side and the Sasanian Empire on the other, and these are both like weak sort of empires in decline. And then you could have this, well, hey, this growing, Muslim sort of population, just sort of because I know the Chechen birth rates are they're just replacing Russians. I know that there's just no way around it.
Yeah.
But it's something that I've been thinking about because, that people say, well, America has their own demographic or internal problems, but Russia sure as hell does as well.
Yeah, and so does Europe as well. I mean, we're all, in this downward spiral. And that's just a reality. But what are Chechens as a percentage of the population? Aren't they like 5%? So Muslims will be a majority in 25 years. That seems a bit
No.
strong.
It's No, I didn't. I was like supposed to be like a third of
Oh, a
the
third.
population,
Okay,
and
that's
it's
more believable.
yeah. They're also in like the Kazan, like kind of, I think in Kazan that area. There's a big Muslim population, but yeah, I mean, this is something that the Russian Orthodox Church is also concerned about.
Sure.
But I don't. I mean, I don't know. That's just all I had to really say on the
Yeah,
topic.
no, those are some good comments. Juan, do you want to speak, and then I'll go to Owen. I think you've been waiting as well.
Yes, thanks for allowing me the time to speak. Thanks for putting this together. I got
Sure.
kind of a two-part question here. I heard you mention civilization, so my first question, do you, on a scale of 1 through 10, how much do you subscribe to Samuel P. Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, 1 being no, 10 being yes, that's kind of the way the world is moving? And then the second part to that question, well, actually, could you answer that one first?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm tempted to say 10. I mean, I was evoking Samuel Huntington. I
Okay.
haven't read that book in a long time, so I might have some disagreements with it, but that is more or less what I am talking about. How the world is breaking down into these civilizational states.
Okay, so that sets up my second question, so I can actually ask it. So I'm just trying to get a sense on
But
where
also,
you.
for the record, I think Fukuyama offered like a weird, an accurate description of this unipolar moment. That was the unipolar moment was actually coined by Krauthammer, but
Charles
the end of
Krauthammer?
yeah the
Okay.
end of history concept like is an accurate depiction of neoliberal nihilism. I mean it. I don't know. I guess kind of as a I'm being a bit Hegelian. Like I'm kind of fusing them. Like I think both were like very interesting, important paradigms. I think we're moving towards civilizational states, but that kind of like the last man in the end of history. I think that was like a very accurate description of where we were.
Okay, thanks. And then the second part of my question, then I'll mute myself. So to achieve that, maybe what I'm sensing is for a larger European consciousness, I think I've heard you use that term.
Yeah.
Your position is for your faction to be for something instead of constantly being negative, no,
Yes.
banning. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. We have to be for something. I mean, just like what did Bannon say in 2017 at CPAC? He said, we want to deconstruct the administrative state or whatever. I mean, it's like, well, what are you replacing it with? Why does it exist? What are you actually for? Are you just merely for agitation, or do you really want something? And I don't think Bannon could answer that.
You just got to be for something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Owen, do you want to talk?
Hi, Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So there's clearly a lot of very open neo-Nazi sympathies within Ukraine. You have Azov Battalion and all that. I don't know just how widespread it is exactly, but there's enough that it's very visible even on the mainstream Western media. And now you've got millions of Ukrainians fleeing west, no doubt being pretty radicalized along the way. What do you think are the odds that this strengthens or even helps sort of normalize that brand of the radical right in the rest of Europe, especially when you combine that with things like Germany suddenly remilitarizing?
I think Azov Battalion can be really overestimated. I mean, I think I think it is true that they are neo-Nazis. Now, there's an interesting some research of the degree to which they're being funded by Ukrainian oligarchs, so Jewish oligarchs. So there are all these contradictions going on in Ukraine, where they're being denazified by Putin. They have a Jewish president. You have this crazed, neo-Nazi stormtrooper battalion. You also have far right elements that support Russia. I mean, it's just very complicated. I wouldn't read too much into this. I don't think neo-Nazi street fighters are going to be, you know, the winners of all of this. And in Germany, there is a neo-Nazi presence that's a lot in East Germany, mainly, and it does seem to be a kind of strong, understandable, strong reaction against lower living standards in the West and the kind of failure of communism. Who are we now? What do we do? Kind of thing. But I don't think. Again, I think we're returning to the stability of the 20th century. I don't think we are going to some like new, I don't think the neo-Nazis are going to win this thing. And how they come out of the war, remains to be seen. I wouldn't hazard a prediction on that.
All right, thanks for the answer.
Sure. All right. You can just jump in if you want to. We have a new speaker, Luke. Would you like to speak? Luke Cross.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
If Luke doesn't want to. Do you think that I'm kind of curious on your? I joined somewhat late, so you may have already discussed this, but your angle on Ukraine do you think that a violent conflict between Ukraine and Russia was inevitable?
I think it was. I think it was always this question hanging out there, and first off, Kiev and Moscow are the poles of Russian imperialism. There is a tremendous amount of similarity, like genetic similarity, cultural, religious, although a little bit tricky, but religious similarity between Russians and Ukrainians. There is a Catholic element in Ukraine, of course.
Well, then what? But
the main
curious.
thing is geostrategic. I mean,
right.
Hitler marched a army to the Caspian, and Russia fears being surrounded in that way. So Russia feels like Ukraine is just a must. Like there is no real security, at least in conventional war, without Ukraine. Now, in 91, Ukraine voted overwhelmingly to become a separate nation state. There is a strong push towards the West, and I think Putin has exacerbated that, 100-fold by invading the country, believe it or not. But so we're just in this conundrum, and there's no real answer. I mean, I genuinely believe that Putin thinks that there is no Russian security without Ukraine.
Yeah,
now
I would agree with you, and so would Keenan and Kissinger, and many other foreign policy, luminaries, I suppose. Which makes me wonder why. I've seen some people say that NATO waffling over whether to admit Ukraine or not created the situation. Instead of giving a definitive no or welcoming them, they kind of half held out the hand, I guess, which created this, like handshake deal where if Ukraine got entangled with Russia, then NATO would be there to back them up. And, it's pretty clear that
I think what's going to happen, my prediction is that there's going to be a German solution for Ukraine. So I think Ukraine might very well be divided.
Interesting.
And that's going to come as the culmination of this war.
West of Kiev?
Yes, something like that. And Kiev would be held by Russia, and it would be in Russia, and it would be in the sphere.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But I think the problem with American foreign policy as well is that we don't have like John Mearsheimer making these decisions, or Henry Kissinger, or whomever. We have lots of different factions. I think there are some very strongly anti-Russian factions. There are people who probably unthinkingly just say like, well, yeah, let's just expand the West. Great.
Well, I mean, I'm just wondering why not just give Russia what they want in Ukraine? I mean, how does that benefit the West?
That we could have done that. Like if if John Mearsheimer had been the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor, or whatever, in like the Obama years, something like that could have actually happened. And there maybe even in 2014, but obviously the U.S., Victoria Nuland, et cetera, they were supporting the westernization of Ukraine, and they might be overly anti-Russian. They might be the types that are like, yeah, we agree with Putin's assessment. Ukraine is vital to Russian security. Thus, let's take it away and all of Russia will fall.
Yeah.
They might be very nasty. Again, I don't know what's in their head, but, we can suggest that. But, that could have happened. We could have neutralized Ukraine. I've suggested this. This is armchair quarterbacking, but I've suggested saying, you allowed Ukraine in NATO, but then you you allow Ukraine in the EU, but not NATO. So the Ukraine relies on Russia for security, but then takes advantage of Western, economics. I think that would have been like the kind of solution that,
Yeah.
brilliant solution that I would have offered. But
Well,
we are
it
just
seems
past it now. It's like that's,
yeah. I know that we're past it. It does seem like NATO's expansion east has created the problem, and the question is, why has NATO expanded so aggressively east, starting in Clinton, adding all the Romania, Hungary, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just been constant pressure on Russia for 30 years. It's as if NATO wants a war with Russia, and now Ukraine is sitting there like the prize turkey, and I mean, it was just waiting to happen. I mean, it's like the only way that the U.S. could have avoided war, or NATO could have avoided war, if they said no, Ukraine will not go into NATO, and they wouldn't even do that. But they know that not doing that would have set up a conflict.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know what's in their head,
even
but it
doing
just
that
seems like
might
they're
not have been enough, because Putin would have been like, well, you're just, you're fickle. You're going to change your mind. There's going to be a new administration. You're going to change your mind. I don't buy this. Ukraine has to be part of the Russian sphere.
Yeah, well, that's where we are, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it was just it was a question mark. It was irresolvable, and we are now back here. And in a weird way, like the Cold War never ended. Like, if I'm correct, and we're going to have this like long-term stability, it seems to indicate that there's some like deep structural force that creates these bifurcated worlds, and like the last 30 years was kind of an aberration.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll wrap up my time here with just one. So what is supporting Ukraine? What is that actually? Is that like proxy support for the West? I just don't understand aside from people who have been, obviously duped by some pretty honestly effective propaganda. I don't understand, like, what does the West get out of supporting Ukraine except for express like a pressure release valve against Russia, who's just persona non grata for whatever reason.
Well, I mean, I don't think Russia wants to expand beyond Ukraine, but I mean, again, not at least. I don't think that's in their direct like sights of their gun.
Yeah,
but I don't know. Again, it's like NATO exists. NATO is an anti-Russian alliance. Therefore, NATO no lanky. It's kind of, things are really basic on some level. I don't. I guess I'm kind of past the idea of like blaming everything on NATO advancement, because it's like, well, that's what NATO is. And to really contemplate ending NATO, or the wild, outside of the box, impossible thing that I suggested, which is bring Russia into NATO and make a northern hemispheric military alliance, that we're it's just not going to happen. I mean, it's this is what NATO does. It's what it is. It's an anti-Russian alliance. So of course it's worried about
Yeah.
this.
I mean, Ukraine is literally the only one where there was like a hard line drawn in the sand, is what I'm saying. I mean, it's so
Not
it's
Georgia. I mean, Georgia relations with Putin improved, after Georgia. I mean, Georgia did nothing. That is not a vital interest. But
yeah.
Ukraine is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know.
it
I
was a
guess I
red
just
line. It's revealed itself, and it's a huge red line.
yeah, I guess personally I see Ukraine and I think, okay, Russia can have Ukraine. Who gives a shit? I mean,
Yeah, I
sure.
understand that
The
perspective.
Ukrainians.
Well, the Ukrainians do give a shit, yes.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Or a lot of them, at least. I mean,
Um,
there are the separatist regions and so on who might very well like the idea, but yeah, I mean, it's
So it's the
a
populist
serious thing.
revolution in Ukraine. Gotta love it.
Yeah. All right. Andrew, you wanted to get back in the game?
Yeah. So I was kind of thinking when you mentioned about that like olive branch that Biden was giving to like the vaccine skeptics, it's like, I mean, to me, it's like, well, hey, now that we're actually not facing like stupid, uh, well, I don't want to get you kicked. Not that we're now that we're beyond like the woke stuff, we have to push that aside. And there's a real potential conflict. Like, okay, we need your help because, I mean, who are the people that are really like necessary in the military, or rather, who make up the military? And it's like people who are conservative, more likely to
Yeah.
have like that kind of hesitancy or skepticism, whatever, paranoia. And I see that. That's one thing I wanted to mention. And it's just like, I mean, Ed Dutton posted like that meme. I'm sure you saw it. It was like a week ago or something like that. It's just like, now you want, like, I mean, you spent forever just shitting on, this kind of demographic, and now you want their help, fighting. It's almost like, I don't know, almost gets to like a Gene level, like RK kind of like, hey, help me fight this war, buddy. Like, hey, remember how I, shit on you like for ever, because you're a white male or whatever. But like now I need you to, I need you at the front lines, potentially, not now, of course,
Yeah.
but I that's like, dude, fuck you. But anyway, this one thing I was thinking about. The other thing I was thinking about was, what does this look like now with China? I don't like. I remember that was a thing that Mearsheimer said a long time ago, just a long time ago. I was listening to it, that like isolating Russia is not a good idea, and it'll push them further into China's hands. And I don't know, does that make Eurasianism a thing? Like, if I even know what the hell Eurasianism is.
Yeah, I mean, look, Russia could be the little brother of China, and all of that natural gas and oil that was going to go to Germany can go to China.
Yeah.
And and this is probably why China has kind of kept that idea in its back pocket, and that's why it hasn't condemned the invasion. Very possible. Like that's not a good thing. I mean, I think someone like Mersheimer does think a lot like me on some level. Like I think he kind of likes the idea of Russia supplying gas to Germany. It's kind of like, well, it's all European. You're kind of uniting the heartland Europe and Central Europe, and this works.
Right.
And I again, that is very much an outcome that is very possible, which is you have real Eurasianism. Now, are people going to think about Vladimir Putin as the great white hope when he is totally disconnected from the West and has an impoverished country and supplying natural resources via his oligarchs to the Chinese? I mean, it'd be harder to paint him in such a light.
Right.
That would probably have tremendous effect on Russian culture and demographics as well.
Yeah.
All right. Lightning Patriot, you want to talk? You have to unmute. Okay. There you are. Okay, you're muted again. All right. Anyone else, or have we said it all? Oh, we have a new request. I'll let him speak.
I'm just struggling with what it seems to be especially Americans with what people who support Russia think could possibly be beneficial to America or the UK for. I've heard people say like it would weaken NATO or it would weaken the dollar, and then they would create their own currency which would be beneficial somehow. But surely, regardless of what happens, Russia having more power is not of any benefit to the West because, they're strategic allies, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay, Lightning Patriot.
Okay, yeah. In some ways, this sort of situation, maybe not with a full-on Russian invasion, which we have right now, but the idea of Ukraine, the Ukrainian crisis deepening, there's almost an element to kind of like Ukraine with Yugoslavia in the 90s, where, I didn't live in the 90s, but I remember during the 2016 election, there was a lot of people. I remember there were a lot of Serbian nationalists in our circles who were saying how evil Bill Clinton and the Democrats were, ignoring, George H.W. Bush also being involved, but but that there's this sort of repetition with Ukraine. It's just repeating the same thing in, a different setting. There's also, I forgot, I had this, just 1 second. But there's also, I feel like there's some differences between Yugoslavia and Ukraine. Where did I put it?
Yeah. Well, they're huge.
Yes.
Differences. I mean, the first is that Yugoslavia was a creation of the First World War, actually, but then it was a breakdown at the end of communism. It was brutal, nasty civil war on both sides, and it was a kind of humanitarian intervention concept, which was fairly new in the 90s. So now I don't think anyone's really talking about a humanitarian intervention in Ukraine. I mean, people are talking about Russian aggression, of course. They're forgetting any bad thing we did, but they're also talking about a new neo-Cold War, and that is, they are very different things.
Yeah, and we launched an offensive against Yugoslavia/Serbia while Russia's launching an offensive against Ukraine. Yeah.
Right.
And there's not really that much of a balkanization. I mean, it's mostly just a small, within a very small Russian minority in Crimea and parts of the Donbass, which most of the Russian minority is pro-Ukrainian. So that was the other big contrast, because a lot of Serbs in, throughout Yugoslavia kind of said, oh, we're just going to separate, while the minority in Ukraine is still very, kind of has this. That's another comparison. I would say it's kind of similar. There's some. You're probably familiar with some of the kind of weirder pan-Hispanic nationalism in these circles, where some people have this idea of like Mexico or like some sort of cosmic race, you know, Hispanosphere annexing like the American Southwest. But few recognize a lot of the Hispanic immigration into the southwestern region. It's a lot of those people don't want to join Latin America. And top of that, I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but I remember seeing an article going around that like some governors in Mexico actually want to like leave AMLO and join the U.S. So it's an example where some people get this perception that a like-minded culture or ethnicity wants to join them, and then it's really quite the contrary.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Singularity is coming. Would you like to speak? You've been waiting for a little while.
I guess the last thing I want to say is with the failure of the NJP to stand up for white people in Ukraine and taking this weird antisocial Putin tact, how can we advocate for whites around the world in our interests?
Well, I mean, I think that I am advocating for whites around the world and our interests in my own way. I am not in charge of a political party. I am not in charge. You know, I'm not out there feeding poor whites, you know, who are suffering or something. But I am talking about bigger things, which is the unification and centralization of whites around the world. And that is, again, it's a controversial idea. It's a heady idea, but I am doing that in my own way. You know, the NJP thing. I mean, I, I, I don't. They're strongly taking Putin's side. Is that what they're doing on Telegram? You know, is that what's happening?
Yeah, they just want Ukraine to throw down their arms, and Putin is the base leader who has every right to run into Ukraine, and this is all NATO and America's fault, and they just want to bring liberalism. And Ukraine is a fake country, and they've gone the whole gambit of Sputnik/RT nonsense.
Yeah, I guess I'm not terribly surprised. And it is antisocial. It's going against the mainstream of Europe. And if, as I was saying to that Nick Fuentes fan, things have changed. You have to recognize the situation, and you start taking that type of rhetoric too far. I mean, that Nick Fuentes fan was talking about how Putin's going to protect us. What does that mean? He's going to send you money. You're going to defect. You're going to, who knows what they mean. All of those things are going to get you thrown into prison ultimately if you pursue them to their final course. And it's not funny. And when we were, even a month ago, when relations between, you know, Russia and the United States were in a very different place, you could kind of, you know, say, oh, Putin's a badass, I love that guy, so much fun. You could say all that stuff, it's fine. We're in a different place right now, and this is serious. This is not internet lulz. There is a new divided world right now. And this isn't the alt-right of 2016. It's not even Charlottesville. Charlottesville, obviously, you know, very bad thing happened in Charlottesville in terms of the death. But that was a, you know, totally above board type of action. No one's going to get, you know, persecuted for treason, for engaging in that kind of stuff. You keep pushing these things, J6, you are going to get persecuted and prosecuted for that. You start joking around in a new neo-Cold War era, you're going to be in a jail cell. Not to mention, you're going to be looked at as a non-person by the rest of society. Just not worth it. Even if you genuinely believe in it, it's not worth it. And I don't genuinely believe in it. I'm not just saying this purely out of fear, but it's just a very serious thing. And these are just internet creatures, and they're not able to recognize the severity of all this.
Hey, thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to mention. So you mentioned the German solution for Ukraine.
Yes.
Maybe I'm naive, but it just doesn't seem feasible. I mean, there's already a lot of hostility, and now if the war gets more brutal, then it increases, and it would require a lot of force. I mean, it's not 1949 anymore.
Well, what are you talking about exactly? I'm suggesting that a division of Ukraine is possible. What are you? What exactly are you talking about?
I mean, people wouldn't accept it. I mean, just
Who
how
wouldn't
can they
accept it?
enforce it? Ukrainians.
Well, much like in Germany, there might be many people who don't accept it but are forced to. I mean, I'm just suggesting this. This is my bold prediction because I'm looking back at history and seeing what happened previously and what could happen again. My bold prediction is that we're going to ultimately see this war is not going as planned for Putin. It's not just a knockout blow on Ukraine. And so I think it's actually going to be a more difficult situation, slog. And there could even be an insurgency if Kiev falls. And I think at some point, bigger players are going to come in and say, well, this is how we're going to solve this problem. That's just my suggestion. I might very well be wrong, but in terms of not accepting it, I mean, first off, there are certainly Ukrainians in the East who would gladly accept it. There are some Ukrainians who would be in the Western part that would accept it. There would be some who would flee, some who would be trapped. You know, it's just the tragedy of history.
All right.
All right, real quick, Luke Cross, and then I'm gonna go. My throat is, seen better days. Have you guys? Is there some virus going around the country? Like an endless cough, but you otherwise feel fine. Like I actually even exercised today. I felt good, but this cough will not leave. Anyway, Luke, would you like to? Oh, I have to let you in. All right, Luke, you're the last one.
Yo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, hey, just on what the others heard, like a couple of speakers earlier, someone mentioned the likelihood of Ukrainian refugees being like radicalized or coming out of Azov. And then someone spoke about the NJP or something. What I've seen, man, is a lot of like huge division on the dissident right so far. So you have like a lot of Telegram, extreme chats are absolutely siding with Ukraine, mostly due to like what they think are like, white assets like Azov or whatever. But you were saying earlier as well about how it wouldn't be politically viable to, support Russia. Obviously, we know where it comes from. Over a long time, the Russian state has like been saying a lot of things that people on the right would like interpret as emboldening them. So criticizing, like liberalism in the West. And I mean, I even remember years ago there were like Russian banks were giving loans to like Le Front National in France and that kind of thing. So I kind of see where it comes from. But a lot of like the sort of like the MAGA right, the Trump supporters are, from what I've seen on social media, basically, taking an anti-war approach or a neutral approach to Russia, if not supporting it, while the extreme right have kind of like absolutely like denounced, like Putin sending fucking sanctions to Ukraine. So I think actually like what's really going to happen is like the right is going to be really divided. You have a lot of like the moderate kind of, well, moderate by, whatever standards, like Trump kind of like MAGA right is, they've warmed to Putin and Russia over the years because of, their stance toward like liberalism or whatever. The extreme right, they're looking at Azov and they're looking at like a few other assets in Ukraine and, they absolutely disagree. So I think like the hard right and the dissident right are absolutely going to play fractioning over this for sure.
That's good. If you know, at one point I thought a big tent was good. Now I just think things need to fracture, and if people are going to make stupid decisions, they can make stupid decisions. The way what I've noticed on my timeline is you have a kind of neo paleo conservative movement that are coming out and basically saying, well, we're against intervention or something. So they're basically replaying the Iraq War. This is not the Iraq War. There are very few similarities between Iraq and Ukraine. And although I understand the sentiment, I obviously agree with the sentiment of like, let's not start World War III over this. Of course, I agree with that. The fact is, what they're missing is that we are returning to the 20th century. And there is going to be a long-term Cold War conflict with Russia, in my estimation. And so, like, you have to factor in sound analysis before you can start, like, offering up your 2 cents. Biden might get brought into this. Okay, fair enough. But he clearly and explicitly does not want to intervene in Ukraine. Because if he intervenes in Ukraine, all NATO is exposed, and we've got literally World War III on our hands. So he is not going to do that. He's going to go right up to the edge of that, but then make sure that he doesn't expose NATO if he's sane. So all of this non-intervention talk is out of the 90s and out of the 2000s. It has no resonance with where we are right now.
Yeah, sure, I agree with that. Yeah.
You know, and in terms of like the far right, you're going to have these, you know, NJP, America First, or whatever. They're going to be like, you know, we love Putin. Let's weaken the West. Fuck NATO. Blah blah blah. They're going to play that game. That again, at some point, that game is not going to be fun. The joke is going to be over because we've entered a new paradigm, and you just cannot say that nonsense. And I don't know. I can't say this enough.
You mentioned before about liberals outflanking the right on nationalism or something before.
Yes.
And as we're like, you know, like if we're trying to like look a little bit forward into the future, like post-war, whatever like kind of happens, obviously for Eastern Europe, where moves toward maybe like our kind of tendencies on social issues or politics might be, you know, some of the friendliest places in the wide world. Like obviously those issues or those wars and the conflicts, they're going to have a huge stain on Europe and a huge after effect. And, you know, ideas that are sympathetic to like ethno-pluralism, for example, might be put on the back burner a lot. How would you suggest that we like work within that? How would you suggest we deal with like liberals sort of like outflanking us on these kind of issues, right? We still want to be able to beat them.
Well, they're not going to outflank us in the sense, at least as I conceive of myself. I don't conceive of myself as a populist. So, like the populist, there's going to be this again. I said this to Ed Dutton over the weekend. I've said this on JF's program. Everyone looks at me with a skeptical eye, and I understand why. And maybe I'm engaging in wishful thinking. I think wokeness is going to be dialed back several notches because you can't have, you know, tranny story hour, drag queen story hour when, you know, there's the Russians are invading a country and we've got to get on war footing. You cannot do that. And if the West does that, it will lose. So I do not. I basically take my opponent as smart. I think populism. I just think the whole populist moment is just over. It's spent. It was never able to generate anything. It doesn't make sense. It is weird and highly conspiratorial and kind of schizophrenic. I just don't think it works. It's over. And so they are going to be outflanked. The liberals are going to be more nationalistic, even Hillary Clinton. And she said a few dumb things on a recent interview, I think with Rachel Maddow, but she was also kind of saying things like, basically McCarthyism. Like, we need to call out the people who are praising Putin. You know, she's serious, and she is going to play the McCarthy nationalist card against populists who defeated her in 2016. And that's going to work because we're returning to an environment of fear. And so I just think the populist over. I mean, this sounds insane, I guess, but I could see a revival of Mitt Romney in the next few years. As you know, he is a smart guy. He's older now, but he's still like spry and handsome. In fact, I could see him having a revived political career, even a presidential run. Call me crazy if you must. But the populist stuff, it's just over. All right, Juan, I'm getting a little tired, but you can jump in if you'd like. All right, Juan.
Thanks again. Two questions. If you can answer the first one, it is nuclear weapons in the current situation. ICBMs, first option. Second, tactical nuclear weapons, low yield nuclear weapons. Second. Third option, bluster, nothing.
What should we
do?
No.
What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, I've said before, I think there's a absolutely non-zero chance that some kind of nuclear weapon is used, and I probably would suggest that that's low yield.
Okay.
A GoldenEye attack. Whoa, this really brings me back to the 90s. I don't know. I that would be remarkable. Excuse me. Bluster. I think bluster is the most likely case, and that's the most, humane way of doing things. Where we basically the Ukraine question gets answered in some way, whether it's division, whether it's full falling to Russia, whether it's seems unlikely, but Russia pulls out due to insurgency or whatever. I mean, that seems the least likely, but certainly possible.
So
the Ukraine question gets answered, and we just have a Cold War, and there's a lot of bluster.
So if I understand you correctly, it's nothing.
Nothing is what I hope will happen.
Okay.
And what I think will happen.
Okay, so I'll just run with that. Then my second question: European consciousness is achieved. Where does North America and ethnic Mexicans? I'm Mexican. 100% born and raised in the U.S. Where do we fit in the U.S. in a world where larger European consciousness, not only in Europe, but the U.S. is achieved? What does that look like?
It's a good question. And it's hard to answer because that term Hispanic is so broad and it almost can't be really defined. There is a lot of intermarriage between whites and Hispanics, and how exactly their children identify is questionable.
Yeah, you hit the nose on the head. I have two children that are half white and half Mexican. I mean, I consider myself, I'm culturally white. One of my parents is from Mexico. I don't really speak Spanish. And somebody pointed out earlier, I don't want I don't want Mexico seizing anything. The borders are, and to me will stay that way. And that's even for, and I have cousins in Mexico. Half of my one parent side is on the Mexican side.
Yeah.
So I reject that idea.
I guess you're on the team then.
Okay. All right. So, well, I mean, I don't know what that means exactly, but I'm just trying to figure out because I have a caricature in my head of you, and I'm just trying to sort out because I kind of tune back into certain things.
A lot of people have a caricature of me in the head. I really don't want to litigate some you know, but both painful and in some ways tedious question of like, you know, are you purely white or something like this? I think it's, you know, it's kind of like if we can solve the big issues, then these smaller issues will be fine. You know, that's just my opinion. I don't really want to get into some kind of like literal, in this case, purity test.
Yeah, makes sense.
With
Thank you
people.
for
Yeah,
answering the questions. I appreciate it. Thanks.
sure. All right. All right. Juice. All right. I'm too generous. All right. Juche King. Then this is it. This is the last one. I'm getting tired.
Hey, Richard.
All right, you have the floor.
Hi.
Okay.
You mentioned that you had like a lingering cough this whole week. So, for my advice, I recommend Super Male Vitality. You know, it's known to get rid of coughs in like 2 seconds. So,
Can I buy that at InfoWars? Thanks for the advice. All right, that's a good one to end on. All right, thanks for being in the space. Thank you everyone who listened, and thanks for everyone who contributed. And that last joke was good. You know, I'll send you a Bitcoin. All right. Talk to you guys later. Ciao.